Hello, MCU fans! So today we're going to take a look at the full X-Men timeline going down to the month and year for every single entry. Now, I did a video on this about a year ago, but there has been so much new information that's come out since then and so many new videos that I made that it's time to combine all of this together into what I hope to be the final, ultimate X-Men timeline. Also, I want to thank right up front Billy, Will, X-Person, Specs, and Jay Hassett. You all were so helpful in putting this together. So anything that's right in the video, you can thank them. And of course, anything wrong, well, that would be my fault. So I'm going to try to keep spoilers to a minimum, but there will be spoilers for pretty much everything in the X-Men universe. But as long as you're okay with that, then let's dive right in and see what we can find out. Don't forget, we have an August contest running all month long. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, and you could win a book or a steelbook. Best of luck. And we have a membership option with lots of cool perks, so you might check it out in case you're interested. Plus, hang around to the end of the video, and we'll talk about the Doomsday Countdown rewatch on the Discord. Okay, so before we get to the timeline itself, I want to do a little prep work up front. I want to talk about the 25 Moments website and how that's going to be used in the video, about the OG Trilogy placement, might be the most controversial concept in all of the timeline, and then whether the Gifted, Deadpool, New Mutants, Logan, and Legion are part of the main universe or not. And we're going to look at what the creative teams has told us about each of those things. And of course, you can skip past any of these you're not interested in by using the different chapter headings. All right, so let's start with the 25 Moments website. So this thing is so cool. It was put out by Fox around the time of Days of Future Past, and sure enough, it covers 25 key moments in the history of the X-Men leading up to that movie. Now, it's no longer out there, but you can find it at web.archive.org, and I'll leave a pinned comment so you can locate the website and check it out. Make sure to scroll up and down, though, because in addition to the 25 moments, including this one, which is Magneto's involvement in the Cuban Missile Crisis, there's also some really cool videos from Trask Industries, so you can learn about the different tools and technology that they came up with. So yeah, go check out that website, but I will be referencing all 25 moments in this timeline video. All right, so now on to the OG Trilogy placement. Man, always a lively topic, right? So I've basically seen two schools of thought. X-Men Origins Wolverine in 1988, which puts the OG trilogy in the 2000s, or X-Men Origins Wolverine in 79, which pulls the OG trilogy back into the 90s. I've actually fallen into both of these schools of thought at different times, but I'll talk about which one I've landed on for this video. All right, so first, let's talk about Origins Wolverine and why I think it does end in 1979. Remember, they're approaching 3 Mile Island, and in particular, they're saying no one's going to snoop around a nuclear reactor. So the key is, we haven't yet had the incident that shut down the nuclear reactor. It is active. And IRL, we've seen that in March of 1979, that's when there was the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island. And the movie seems to be saying that the final battle with Deadpool, Sabretooth, and that crappy Deadpool, that's what created the incident at 3 Mile Island. All right, so then we go back to 1973, because we go back 6 years earlier, and then we get further evidence of the 1973 date in Days of Future Past, because we get this newspaper heading that says January of 1973, and of course this is when Wolverine's mind is sent back in time, and of course rewrites things and gives us our second X-Men timeline. All right, so then let's talk about the OG trilogy. That's where we get the infamous 15 years line, right? Where Professor X is saying, Logan, it's been almost 15 years, hasn't it? And of course, he's referring to the end of X-Men Origins Wolverine when Logan is shot in the head with the adamantium bullet and loses his memory. And of course, the line comes back again in X2, only this time it's actually said by Stryker himself, who's the one that shot him in the head with the bullet when he says, how long has it been? 15 years. So they're really tying this 15 years line to connect X-Men Origins Wolverine and the OG trilogy. But it gets more complicated because the X-Men trilogy seems to be in, quote-unquote, the not-too-distant future. So since the movies came out in the 2000s, that implies they're, in the 2000s. And we see it again in The Last Stand, the not-too-distant future. Speaking of The Last Stand, we see Beast reading a magazine, and I know it's a little blurry, but it says October of 2005. So we have to be after that point. And then the 25 Moments website says 2006 is the exact year for The Last Stand, because notice it says, warring mutant factions destroy the Golden Gate Bridge, obviously referring to the events of The Last Stand. Now, I will say that even the 25 Moments website seems to have a few issues on it, because notice it says 2013 is when Trask announces the Mark X Sentinels, of course the ones we see in Days of Future Past, but elsewhere on the website, it says it was 2020. So I'll talk more about that when we get to Days of Future Past. The point I'm trying to make is there's always going to be inconsistencies. It's just impossible to avoid them. So instead, we just have to pick the best location to put the OG trilogy. All right, so if we kind of summarize what I've said up to this point, we have the beginning of X-Men Origins Wolverine in 1973, then we jump 6 years to the end in 1979. It's then connected with the OG trilogy by the 15 years line, but seemingly we have to place the X-Men trilogy in the 2000s because not only did The Last Stand get listed as being in 2006 on 25 Moments, but of course the OG trilogy is said to be in the not-too-distant future. But you can't be in the not-too-distant future and also be only 15 years after X-Men Origins Wolverine. So how do we deal with this seemingly irreconcilable issue? Well, of all things, Dark Phoenix may provide the answer. I know, who would have thought, right? So let's talk about Jean Grey's 2 childhood flashbacks. So we learn in The Last Stand that 20 years ago, Professor X showed up at Jean Grey's doorstep and, of course, brought her into the X-Men fold. So let's place that in our timeline. It's 20 years earlier, so that would be 1986 if The Last Stand is in 2006. Okay, great. All right, so now the Dark Phoenix movie gives us the second of her 2 childhood flashbacks. They tell us it's 1975, and we see a young Jean Grey. Her parents are seemingly killed in an auto accident, and Professor X shows up at her doorstep and invites her to become an X-Men. And we even learn that she was 8 years old. So therefore, we have 2 Jean Grey childhood flashbacks. On the left is the revised timeline, and on the right is the OG timeline. And a big thanks to Jake and his video X-Men Movie Continuity, How to Fix the Timeline, because he's the one that came up with this amazing solution. Okay, so now let's add in that flashback from the revised timeline. We have Days of Future Past in 1973 when Wolverine's mind is sent back in the past, and now we know that in 1975, she's 8 years old. So that's really helpful. That means we can say that she was born sometime between 1966 and 1967. We have a little bit of wiggle room because we don't know when her exact birthday was, so we don't know whether she just turned 8 or whether she's just about to turn 9. But anyway, what's so helpful is that means she was born before the timeline was reset. So her birthday hasn't changed, even in the revised timeline. Okay, so now when we look at this doesn't really work, right? Because if she's 8 years old in 1975, then she would be 19, maybe even 20 years old in 1986. And she is not 20 years old. In fact, the actress is only 13 years old. Okay, so what can we do with this? Well, if we back it to 1979, which again, we got some wiggle room because we don't know if she was born in 66 or 67, but I'm going to go with 1979, and you'll see why in a second here, because that now makes this line from the first X-Men movie work so perfectly. Professor X says, Cyclops, Storm, and Jean were some of my first students. So, of course, in X-Men Origins Wolverine, we see Professor X showing up, saying you're safe now, and bringing Cyclops, as well as some others, to his school. But now, if we move this flashback from 1986 to instead 1979, then that means Jean Grey was picked up in the same year. Yes, that means 1979 is when the scene on the left and the scene on the right happened. I love that. That's so perfect because we learned that Jean and Scott were some of the first students. Okay, this makes so much more sense to me. So that means both Cyclops and Jean Grey were brought in to be X-Men in 1979 in that original timeline. I really, really like that. So what do we do with The Last Stand? Well, we can move it 20 years after 1979, placing it in 1999. And what do we do with the first 2 movies in the OG trilogy? They're 15 years after 1979, placing them in 1994. That means we have to ignore the references to the not-too-distant future, but I think the Dark Phoenix movie retconned that to make this all work. Now, I do realize that creates an issue with the song Bye Bye Bye, because in the X2 movie, they turn on the radio and that song's on and they're all groaning because they can't stand it. Well, IRL, that came out in January of 2000. So moving the original trilogy into the 90s creates an issue. Unless, of course, in the X-Men universe, the song just came out earlier, right? It could have come out in the 90s in the X-Men universe. And it is worth noting that the first X-Men movie does have a reference to the Twin Towers. You can see them over there on the right. Yet, I've seen a lot of people place the first X-Men movie in, say, 2003 in their timelines, which means, ignoring basically this cultural reference. So the bottom line is, sometimes there are minor cultural references in the movies that we just have to let go to make the overall story work. So that's the reason you're going to see me placing the original trilogy in the 90s when we get to the timeline. But honestly, at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal. It doesn't have a huge impact on the timeline, whether you put these in the 90s or the 2000s. So now let's talk about some of the different shows and movies and whether they're part of the main X-Men universe. And we'll start with The Gifted. So this one's really interesting. Let's look at this quote from creator Matt Nix in July of 2017 when he said, "Generally, I think one of the great favors that Days of Future Past did for all of us was establish that there are many streams. The short answer is we exist in one of those streams. It's its own universe." So he's talking about streams and universes. Of course, what he's referring to is in Days of Future Past, when they send Wolverine's mind back in time, it creates a new timeline. So basically, he's saying here, the Gifted is in its own universe. All right, that's pretty clear, right? Then let's look at what producer Laura Donner said in September of 2017. She was asked whether the two shows were part of a shared universe, and she said, "I'm sorry to break your heart, no, but thank you for wanting it." So, okay, this seems really clear, right? It's in a separate timeline altogether. And then just a little later in September 2017, Matt Nix seemed to double down again. I love this. He says, now the movies for a time have been telling stories for a time that, if you look at them, are completely incompatible with each other on a timeline level. You think? I mean, obviously, we went through that when we were discussing placing the OG trilogy in the timeline. But then, he says again, we exist in our own universe that's related to everything that's gone on. Okay. Making it pretty clear. But then it starts to get interesting. In October 2018, the actress playing Polaris, Emma Dumont, said, well, I will say, yeah, I mean, the movies don't even align, let's be honest. Sometimes the comics don't align at all. It's totally different. What I will say, we could fit, well, we have many Sentinels. Obviously, it'd be before the future part of Days of Future Past. Okay, so she's kind of hinting at maybe it does fit in the timeline. However, what I really think answers the question once and for all is creator Matt Nix in August of 2021 saying that he found a way around the hurdle. He says, I was just the guy that came up with the best idea for staying out of the way of the movies, which was, hey, remember in Days of Future Past how they go back in time and then there's this anti-mutant dystopia in the future and then in this time it looks like our time? Well, he summed it up by saying, just give me the years in between and then my show will get erased. Wow. I mean, it's kind of depressing to say it that way, but what he's saying is put us in the original timeline before Days of Future Past, and it doesn't matter. It's going to get erased anyway. And oh, by the way, it fits in perfectly because of things like the Sentinels and the anti-mutant dystopia. So I'm going to assume that this means that the Gifted is indeed part of the original timeline, and therefore I'm going to include it in this video. All right, so now let's talk about Deadpool. This one, at least, is a little simpler in my mind. So, producer Simon Kinberg, in January of 2016, pretty much laid it on the line. He said, the world of Deadpool, the world of Gambit, remember there was going to be a Gambit movie, exists in a post-Days of Future Past, post-apocalypse world where all of these stories are the same as our shared history. So he's making it really clear. He's saying that Deadpool is definitely part of the second timeline, the Days of Future Past reset timeline. Okay, so I'm going to include it as part of the universe as well. All right, so now let's talk about the New Mutants. And this one, honestly, is a little bit murkier. So, according to the New Mutants updates on Twitter, director Josh Boone confirmed that the New Mutants early draft would have featured the mutants in the X-Mansion with McAvoy's Xavier and Ship Storm reprising their roles. The movie was also supposed to be in the X-Men Apocalypse timeline, but that was later dropped to make it a standalone. Well, I mean, that seems pretty clear, right? And then we see in August of 2020, director Josh Boone said something very interesting. He said it was meant to be the first of a trilogy. And that's kind of a bummer. I mean, it's not a great movie, but I still would have enjoyed seeing 2 more movies with those same characters in it. Then he went on to say it was meant to be tied at least tangentially to the larger X-Men film series, which was reaching a climactic point with 2019's Dark Phoenix. And he goes on to conclude by saying, obviously it's in the same universe, but not tethered to the Dark Phoenix universe. What? I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. But he did say it's tied to Dark Phoenix, and in fact, when we get to Logan, which is our next topic, we're going to see that all of these are connected in a very interesting way. So I am including New Mutants in my overall timeline. So how about Logan? Is Logan part of the timeline? So James Mangold made things pretty clear when he said it's year 2029 when the movie takes place. There's an epilogue scene in Days of Future Past, which is 2024, 2023, something like that. I just wanted to get far enough past. So, okay, he's making it pretty clear that Logan is in the revised timeline after Days of Future Past. And he goes even further to say it takes place approximately 5 years after the conclusion of Days of Future Past. All right, he's making it very, very clear that Logan is most definitely part of the second timeline. And then this quote from producer Simon Kinberg is incredibly helpful. So he's talking about the mid-credit scene from X-Men Apocalypse, and he explains this is a tease for Mr. Sinister. But then, when he's asked specifically if X-Men Apocalypse end credit sequence and Logan are directly connected, his answer is yes, that is the implication. So, okay, clearly Logan is a part of the second timeline because it's tied directly to X-Men Apocalypse. And then this is where it all comes together. Everything was building towards a Mr. Sinister storyline. I'm so bummed we never got this. So all these different images you see here are from X-Men Apocalypse, New Mutants, Deadpool 2, and Logan. Everything is tied together. So yeah, they are all in the same timeline. And finally, let's talk about Legion and whether it's part of the main universe. So this one they make really clear. So Marvel TV chief Jeff Loeb answered the question, will Legion contain any connection to the other Marvel projects? And he said, X-Men characters live in the Fox world, and we live in a different world. And then creator Noah Hawley said, yes, it's connected. Noah won't really care to tell how. All right then. And he added, there is a periodness to the movies, Hawley said about the recent X-Men films, which have presented themselves like montages in the 70s and 80s. But he said, by hiding the period in Legion, the question is a little more open-ended. And finally, producer Lauren Donner said, Legion is part of the X-Men universe, but obviously we're our own astral plane. We're our own world. So I don't even know what to do with that, right? We're now talking astral planes. So bottom line, Legion is not part of the main X-Men timeline. And we'll see more evidence of that as we dive into the timeline itself. Speaking of, let's get into the timeline. All right, so we start at pre-3600 BCE with Apocalypse assembling the pyramids. And the reason I say pre-3600 BCE is because we do get a specific date for when Apocalypse was betrayed. In fact, here we see a very buff Oscar Isaac who will return much, much later in the timeline. All right, so then we move to 1845, which is Wolverine's childhood in the Northwest Territories of Canada. We see Sabretooth and Jimmy, a.k.a. Logan. And they are now brothers who fight together in several wars, including the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and Vietnam. But before we get to Vietnam, we have to take a stop in 1944 to see what both young Professor X and Magneto are doing. We see Magneto in a prison camp in Poland, while we see Professor X chilling at Westchester, New York in his mansion. So yeah, very different beginnings for these two characters. But of course, their fates will be tied together for many years to come. Then we move to 1945, where we see Wolverine running from the atomic bomb in a flashback from The Wolverine. And then we move to 1962 for X-Men First Class, our first movie in the series. So we know it's in 1962 because, they tell us that very clearly. Geneva, Switzerland, 1962. And the 25 Moments website begins with a moment from this very movie as Magneto is getting involved in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And IRL, we know that occurred in October of 1962, so we even have our month for the movie. It's also worth noting that Professor X will lose the use of his legs in the movie, which will create some interesting continuity discussions down the line. All right, so here is our X-Men timeline so far. We have October 1962 for X-Men First Class. And then we move to 1963 when Eric Lehnsherr, a.k.a. Magneto, is implicated in murder. But not just anyone's murder, the JFK assassination. In fact, there's a video you can check out on the X-Men Movies YouTube site that goes a little bit more into what happened here. And in Days of Future Past, it's alluded to when Professor X mentions what else would explain a bullet miraculously curving through the air. Then we moved to 1965 when Professor X opens the school for gifted youngsters. Now that surprised me at first that he opened it so early, but then we learn in Days of Future Past that just after the first semester, the war in Vietnam got worse and the school ended up closing. Crazy. Then we move to 1967 when Trask Industries starts developing artificial limbs. Of course, they're ultimately going to develop the Sentinels that we'll see in Days of Future Past. Then in 1972, Watergate gets a new twist in the X-Men universe because it turns out those missing moments on the tapes were actually because of a meeting between Trask and Nixon. Crazy, right? Then we move to 1973, which in Days of Future Past, we learn that Trask was assassinated by Mystique. And that leads to Trask Industries then announcing the Sentinel Mark I. President Nixon welcomes the Sentinels with open arms. And we learn the date of when this assassination occurred. It's January 30th of 1973. Of course, in Days of Future Past, they prevent the assassination, but this is when it happened in the first timeline. And it's important to note that January 25th of 1973, IRL, that's when the announcement was made that all GIs will be pulled out of Vietnam in 60 days, so by March of 1973. And that's important because we know that when Trask was assassinated by Mystique, Wolverine was on leave from the war, but I'm betting when they made that announcement that everyone was going to be pulled out in 60 days, he and Sabretooth went back into the war again, because they really seemed to love it, especially Sabretooth, and that's what got them both in so much trouble and thrown in the brig. And that, of course, leads to the formation of Team X probably around March of 1973. And of course, over there on the far left, that would be Deadpool, and we'll be talking a lot more about this particular version of Deadpool. All right, so then we learn that Logan doesn't stay too long with Team X because Sabretooth is telling him we finally have a good thing going here. So my guess is maybe a month, maybe two, so we're maybe May of 1973, Wolverine leaves Team X. Then we move to 1975 when Xavier goes to Washington. The professor makes a closed-door plea to U.S. politicians for basic rights for mutants. Then we move to 1977. I love this. Pietro cheats in track and field events. He breaks 8 world records, sparking a review of mutant participation in athletics. And remember, this is the original timeline. Of course, he's going to show up again in Days of Future Past. Then we move to 1979 for the rest of X-Men Origins Wolverine. Of course, Wolverine gets his adamantium skeleton, has several fights with Sabretooth, also with that crappy Deadpool. He gets shot in the head with an adamantium bullet and loses his memory, and Professor X even makes an appearance. So more about him in a minute. All right, so we know it's 1979 because we get a 6-year time jump from when he left Team X. He's now in the Canadian Rockies 6 years later. And then we also know it's 1979 because the movie explains why 3 Mile Island was ultimately shut down. As they're approaching it, it's really important they say 3 Mile Island, no one's going to snoop around a nuclear reactor. So the key is the 3 Mile Island incident that happens IRL in March of 1979 hasn't occurred yet. In fact, it seems they're implying that the final battle with Sabretooth and crappy Deadpool is what shut down this nuclear reactor. So we're definitely in March of 1979. So now we can look at our timeline so far, and we can add in X-Men Origins Wolverine, which runs from March to May of 1973, and then jumps to March of 1979. But we do need to talk about Professor X showing up at the end of the movie. We see him saying, "You're safe now," and of course he's talking to Cyclops and some of the other mutants that he's going to bring to the X-Mansion. And also in 1979, Professor X and Magneto pay a visit to Jean Grey. This is the flashback from X-Men The Last Stand, happening 20 years earlier, and I love looking at the de-aging. I think Professor X's de-aging looks a little better than Magneto's. His is kind of uncanny valley, but for 2006, this really isn't that bad. But anyway, most importantly is Professor X now brings Jean Grey to the X-Mansion. So both Cyclops and Jean Grey were brought in 1979, which makes this line work really well from the first X-Men movie when Professor X explains that Cyclops, Storm, and Jean were some of my first students. But of course that raises the question of how is Professor X even walking if he was shot in the spine during X-Men First Class? Well, Days of Future Past basically gives us an answer. Beast explains the treatment gives him his legs, so he's taking a treatment that allows him to walk again. But Professor X himself says the treatment for my spine affects my DNA, making it so he can't use his psychic powers. But my guess is by the time of X-Men Origins Wolverine, which was 1979, so basically 6 years after Days of Future Past, he had found a way, at least temporarily, to use his powers and to walk. But eventually, he was going to end up being wheelchair-bound for good. So then we move to 1984 as mutants are dubbed God's Curse by the human majority. Yikes. Then we move to 1986 when the Chernobyl nuclear disaster occurs and the Soviet Union sees a rash of mutant infants afterwards. Very interesting. Then we move to 1988 where we see things start to deviate from real-world events because Germany is the first nation to adopt mutant segregation policies. And this is really interesting. A few renegade mutants knocked down a mile-long section of the Berlin Wall in an act of protest, killing 23 people and injuring over 200. The protest alarmed citizens of West Germany, sparking anti-mutant policies, and the Berlin Wall stands today, and East Germany has been designated a mutant zone. Wild. All right, so then we move to 1989, when a private mutant registry is started. The FBI cracks down on criminals and mutants. Then we move to a flashback from The Last Stand, where Warren Worthington III tries to remove his wings. Oh, this scene was so hard to watch. Yikes. Then we move to 1991, when South Africa becomes a mutant haven. South Africa ushers in a new era of acceptance and equality, becoming a safe haven for mutants. Then we move to 1994, as we see mutant freedom fighters getting involved. The Zapatista Resistance Militia enlists the help of mutant soldiers. The Zapatista Resistance, aided by mutant freedom fighters, engages in armed conflict against the Mexican government in southern Mexico. Then we move to the OG X-Men trilogy, starting in 1994. Now, the movie itself implies that it should be placed in the timeline in the 2000s because it says it's happening in the not-too-distant future, and its IRL release date was 2000. However, it also implies that it's 15 years after 1979, and of course, this is the line that I'm giving precedence to, because this is 15 years after Logan lost his memory after being shot in the head with the adamantium bullet. And it is worth noting that you can see the Twin Towers on a map of New York during the movie. They're over there on the right, so it seems like the movie must be happening before 9/11. So I'm putting it in 1994, but the question is, what month? Well, the weather, and you never know whether you can trust things like the trees, but it seems to imply summer, maybe early fall. In fact, we see a scene where they're on the beach. There's people in bikinis and swim trunks. And in fact, over there on the left, you can see Stan Lee himself. So R.I.P., buddy, R.I.P. But if you look at the trees in the background, some of them have their leaves turning, so, summer or early fall. But I will point out, there have been some freakishly hot days in New York. In fact, notice, here in February, it was 78 degrees, definitely beach weather in 2018. So why am I bringing that up? Well, remember, there were also scenes in this movie in Canada, in fact, northern Alberta, Canada. And in Canada, the snowfall can happen anytime during the year, but typically between October to November to mid-April. So that doesn't really work with summertime. So I'm going to hold off on placing the month for this movie until we get to X2, and then I'll do the two movies as a pair. All right, so X2, X-Men United, is happening in 1994, just like the first X-Men movie. But just like the first movie, it's tricky to place in the timeline because they play the song Bye 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 on the radio. Of course, they're all groaning because they can't stand it. And the song came out in January of 2000. So that implies the movie should be in the 2000s. But the movie also has that same 15-year line that we heard in the first X-Men movie, which implies 15 years after 1979. In fact, it's worth noting, in the first movie, it was, Logan, it's been almost 15 years, and this time, how long has it been? 15 years. So these two movies are definitely happening close together. In fact, that's further implied by this line, when Cyclops says, ever since Liberty Island, which is the first X-Men movie, you've been different. I mean, a month ago, you had to concentrate just to levitate a book or a chair across the room. So that seems to imply there might only be a month in between the two movies. And then also, this is really interesting. The news anchor on TV seems to tie things back to the first movie and this movie being in the same year. So in the closed caption, you can see the anchor saying, the president will address the nation. Then, unfortunately, this line is not in the closed captioning, but if you listen really closely, you can hear him say the Mutant Registration Act earlier this year. And of course, the entire first movie was about that Mutant Registration Act. So it seems like the first two movies are happening within a month of each other and both in 1994. And then we get this really helpful date on a computer screen when people are being scanned before they visit Magneto, and notice the date is March. Okay, so let's call X2 in March, and that means the first X-Men movie is happening in February. Now, one potential continuity issue with the movie is we see Hank McCoy briefly in human form in X2, and of course we see him in, beast mode in X-Men The Last Stand. But that's okay, because in Days of Future Past, we learn way back in 1973 that he was able to transform himself back and forth. In fact, he explains that he takes enough of this medicine that keeps himself balanced. So, yay, that's nice. Days of Future Past really did try to fix a bunch of continuity errors. I appreciate that. All right, so now the X-Men timeline so far, we can add in February 1994 for the first X-Men and March of 1994 for X2. So next, in 1996, we see that X gene testing leads to a global epidemic. Of all things, mad cow disease is blamed on Trask Industries doing gene testing. That is crazy, crazy. So then we move to 1999 for X-Men The Last Stand, and oh my word, everybody dies in this movie. Cyclops, Professor X, Jean Grey. It's utter carnage. Anyway, once again, this movie makes it tricky to place on the timeline because it tells us it's happening in the not-too-distant future, and since it was released in 2006 IRL, one would think we're at least in 2006. We also see Beast reading this magazine, which I know it's a little blurry, but it says October 2005, so that implies we're at least after October 2005, and of course, the 25 Moments flat out tells us it's happening in 2006 because it says that warring mutant factions destroy the Golden Gate Bridge, which obviously happened in The Last Stand. And then I would add that it actually gets pretty hilarious when Bryan Singer is asked, when does Days of Future Past happen? And he says, it's not a sequel to one of the others, it's an in-betweequel. That's what I call it, for lack of a better word. It takes place about 10 years, give or take, after X-Men The Last Stand. What? And in the past, it takes place about 10 years after First Class. Got that? No, we don't got that because it's not 10 years after The Last Stand, it's 10 years after The Wolverine. But if it is 10 years after The Last Stand, that means that movie's in 2013. So anyway, I'm just including this because it just shows that no one can seem to figure out when The Last Stand is actually happening. But as I talked about earlier in the video, so you can check that section out if you skipped it the first time around, I think that the Dark Phoenix movie retcons everything and perfectly gives us the explanation for when the OG trilogy is happening, and that's why I place it in the 90s. Now, it is worth noting that this puts a 5-year gap between X2 and X-Men The Last Stand, and you could argue that perhaps that's a bit too much for it to be 5 years. I mean, you have Wolverine saying, maybe it's time for us to move on, and Cyclops saying, not everybody heals as fast as you, Logan. So, is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? All we know is Cyclops just hasn't gone over the death of Jean Grey yet, so 5 years works. So now the question is, what month or months does the movie take place? Well, the movie begins while school is in session, so it seems it can't be any later than June. During the movie, we see Cyclops visit Alkali Lake, and there's no snow, so that would imply kind of a summertime frame. And then by the end of the movie, we see that a new school session is starting because everyone's moving in, and in an alternate ending, they actually give us the title, New School Year Begins. So, okay, seems like maybe June to perhaps September timeframe. It's also worth noting we get the first look at the Sentinels, and eventually we'll get to those Mark X Sentinels by the time of Days of Future Past. And we also learn how Xavier returns from dying because he does get toasted in the movie, and I still think this is pretty sketch, right? Basically, there's, I guess, a twin of him that he takes over his body? I don't know. I'm just going to let it go because I'm glad Professor X came back. All right, so now we can add The Last Stand going from June to September of 1999. So then we move to 2001, Guantanamo Bay Mutant Detention Center opens. Trask Industries is integral in the construction and secret management of Guantanamo Bay Detention Center. Then in 2008, a mutant wall is built. The wall hinders movement of mutants across the U.S. border. The U.S. erects a 2,000-mile wall along the Mexican border, and politicians maintain that the structure is a necessary measure for the prevention of illegal immigration. Others contend the wall is a last-ditch effort to contain Mexico's growing population of mutant rebels. Then in 2009, the Mutant Inhibitor Collar is created. It's a revolutionary collar that proves that mutant abilities can be suppressed. Then in 2010, and this is crazy, Trask Industries acquires Xavier's school. What on earth? The mutant safe haven becomes a testing lab for Trask Industries. The school for gifted youngsters closes, and Trask Industries renovates the mansion into a research facility. Oh my word. Then we move to 2011 when mutants protest the cure. To protest the billion-dollar mutant cure arms race led by Trask Industries, Yoshida Corp., of course we recognize that name from the Wolverine, right? And other multinational pharmaceutical companies occupy Wall Street marches from the X-Mansion to Zuccotti Park. Sentinels attack the peaceful mutant demonstration, and in the ensuing chaos, Warren Worthington III, the mutant known as the Angel, is killed. Crazy, right? Then in 2012, Blink helps rescue mutants from prison camps. Blink is instrumental in smuggling 30 detained mutants out of Trask prison camps. Then in 2013, we have The Wolverine. And here we can see several action-packed scenes from the movie. Now, I'll say up front, the movie gives us zero indication of what year it's taking place. So I hate to do this, but I'm going to go with the year of release, which is 2013. However, what about the month? They do give us some indication for that. So we see snow in the Yukon, right? And we know it's the Yukon because they give us several indications of that. So, okay, when does it snow in the Yukon? That's between September or October through April. All right, that's very helpful. Then we also see Wolverine running across a bear. Well, in the Yukon, bears typically come out of hibernation between late March and mid-April. Okay, so now we're down to a tighter range, somewhere between March and April. And then we see snow in Japan's upper mountain range, and in those upper mountain ranges, the snow season typically lasts from mid-December to early May. And notice the snow is only in the upper mountains. Okay, so if we take all of that into consideration, seems like April is a good month to place this, so I'm going to go with April of 2013 for the Wolverine. Now, it's also worth noting that we get a post-credit scene that takes place 2 years later, so 2015, and we do see that Professor X is alive after that weird post-credit scene in The Last Stand. And then also we see Trask Industries is working on robotics. And that's why I have a little bit of an issue with this mention in the 25 moments saying that in 2013, in other words, 2 years before that post-credit scene, Trask announces the Sentinel Mark X. That seems really weird that we were just seeing a robotic arm, and now here they are mentioning the Mark X Sentinel. In fact, there is another place on the 25 Moments website that says actually Trask Industries announces the Mark X Sentinel program in 2020. So I'm going to go with 2020, and I'm going to ignore this 2013 reference. You can let me know your thoughts about that in the comments. All right, so then in 2015, we get the death of Hank McCoy. The mutant most famous for successfully integrating with human population is murdered. He's dragged from his home and murdered by an angry mob of human majority protesters outside his home in upstate New York. Goodness gracious. And then we move to 2017 for both seasons of the Gifted TV show. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I do think this is part of the original timeline, and one big reason is the appearance of Blink. She shows up in the series, and then also in Days of Future Past, and of course you can see her here on the left in the series using her powers, and there on the right in Days of Future Past. I also love the fact that we get Lorna Dane Polaris. She was awesome in the series. Now, she's not dating Havoc, so unfortunately we don't get that connection, but still, she is really, really cool. Well worth watching the show, honestly, just for her character. And to kind of tie her to Magneto, they do put her in a plastic prison, so I thought that was kind of cool. Then we also see the antagonists are the Hellfire Club and Sentinel Services. So this is another reason why I really feel like that Mark X Sentinel belongs in 2020, because here we're seeing, these spider-like versions of the Sentinels. So now let's talk about the timeline. All right, so Season 1, Episode 1 is set in springtime because they're practicing for a spring concert. Then, at the end of Season 1, Episode 13, the Struckers lead everyone to believe they died in this big explosion, and in fact, in Season 2, Episode 12, we get a firm date for their supposed deaths, and that date is May of 2017. All right, so Season 1 starts in springtime and ends May 5th of 2017. Now, that does create one small little issue, because also in Season 1, Episode 1, we get, a May date. And it's May 17th and 18th. But of course, that doesn't work because we know that the end of the season is on May 5th. So we kind of have to just ignore that May date. But I'm going to say Season 1 runs from April to May of 2017. All right, so then in Season 2, we get a jump of 6 months later, which we learned that in Episode 1. And then in Season 2, Episode 2, we do get a fall date, but the year's wrong, right? Because we learned at the end of Season 1 that it was 2017, and then we only jumped 6 months forward. So I'm not sure how they messed this up, but yeah, shouldn't be 2018, and that's not the only time this happens. In Season 2, Episode 3, we get another fall date on a newspaper, but once again the wrong year. And then finally in Episode 8, we get another fall date, but once again the wrong year, this time on a computer. So knocking out the 2018 dates, which just don't make sense, I'm going to place The Gifted in April to October of 2017. And then we move to 2018 when Bishop forms the Free Mutants organization. Bishop, a Camp X-ray escapee, builds the global network of mutant resistance dubbed the Free Mutants. And then I'm saying this actually should be the last of the 25 moments because I think it's 2020 when Trask announces the Sentinel Mark X program, which again goes with this timeline here. Then finally, we get to Days of Future Past. So all those 25 moments, everything has been building to this movie. Has to be one of the best movies, top 3 for sure, of all the X-Men movies. And of course, it also takes place in 1973, because when they send Wolverine's mind back in the past, that's when these events are occurring with, of course, the epic scene, maybe my all-time favorite scene in any X-Men movie, with Quicksilver. Oh my goodness, so good, so good. So we get this date in the newspaper telling us that they send Logan's mind back into the past in January of 1973. And remember, this was just a few days after the Paris Peace Accords were signed, which basically ended the Vietnam War. But of course, our troops weren't fully pulled out for another 60 days, and that's really important. And we get confirmation that the 1973 portion of the movie is 10 years after the First Class movie, because they say we haven't had an incident in over 10 years, and then they mention after what happened in Cuba, so they're talking again about the First Class movie, which was in October of 1962, and now we're in January of 1973. So that works really well. And we get confirmation that the future portion of the movie is indeed in 2023, because in 1973, Professor X is saying to Wolverine, 50 years from now? Like in the future, 50 years from now? Referring to when he came from. So yeah, the movie very clearly shows that it's happening in 1973 and 2023. Of course, at this point in 1973, Wolverine is on leave from the Vietnam War, and we see his fate in the new 1973. Because remember, in Wolverine Origins, He went back into the Vietnam War, got himself in trouble, and ended up joining Task Force X. But his new fate is that nasty scene where he gets those metal rods jammed through his body, and then it looks like Mystique actually rescues him as she's pretending to be Stryker. Pretty wild. All right, so then we also see his new fate in 2023. When he wakes up, everybody's back from the dead. Jean Grey died in The Last Stand, but she's back. Cyclops died, but he's back. We learned in the 25 moments that Beast died, but he's back. And then, of course, Storm is back, and even Professor X is back. And then I love this, where he whispers to him, "Welcome back." So it's pretty clear that in the revised timeline, in the new 2023, Professor X remembers the past and very likely fills Wolverine on it as well. And that's going to become very important when we talk about the Logan movie. All right, so now we finally get a month for when the future is happening. Notice on this little globe here, it tells us it's Thursday the 29th of June, and we know the year is 2023. And this works out perfectly because June 29th in 2023 is indeed a Thursday. I love it. All right, so now it's time to add Days of Future Past to the timeline, and it is an interesting one, right? So we start in June of 2023 in the future portion of the movie. Then they send Logan's mind back in time to January of 1973, and we need to connect that up with X-Men First Class because anything prior to January of 1973 occurs both in the original timeline and in the new one. And then we have the future portion, the new revised future portion, in June of 2023. Crazy, right? And what I really like about this is, because Logan's mind was sent back to January of 1973, that's prior to the point in X-Men Origins Wolverine when he and Sabretooth got in so much trouble during the Vietnam War. Really works perfectly. All right, so let's talk briefly about how the rules of time travel work in the MCU. In particular, when Logan's mind was sent into the past, what exactly happened? Well, we learned in Endgame that if you travel to the past, your past becomes your future, and your former present becomes the past, which can't now be changed by your new future. It's a very wordy way of saying if you go into the past, you can't change it, instead you create a branch. So is that what happened when Logan's mind was sent back in the past? Well, not necessarily. I mean, keep in mind that different universes have different Infinity Stones. So, for example, the Reality Stone in one universe might create a reality of paint or a reality of animation. Likewise, the Time Stone in a different universe might allow time to work differently and thus time travel. And another possible explanation is the method used to perform the time travel could end up with different results. So we know that when they used the quantum realm in Endgame, it created branches. But look at all these other methods of time travel we've seen throughout the MCU. It's crazy. So let me know your thoughts. Do you think it created branches, or do you think it rewrote time in the X-Men universe? But either way, we do know that there are two timelines, the original and the revised timeline. In the original timeline, Logan joined Team X, eventually got his adamantium skeleton, and then was shot in the head with the adamantium bullet. And then in the revised timeline, he fell in the water with those nasty metal pipes all over him. He was rescued by Stryker/Mystique, and then ultimately got his adamantium skeleton, which we'll see later on down the line. One thing that is really cool, though, in both timelines, Wolverine fought in all of these various wars, because all of this happened before January of 1973. All right, so now we're in the revised timeline in 1975, and in this flashback, we see that Jean Grey's parents die in an auto accident, and she's taken in by Professor X. Of course, we learn that she's 8 years old, and remember, we basically have two different flashbacks to her childhood, the one in the original timeline on the right, and the one in the revised timeline on the left. All right, so then we move to 1983 for X-Men Apocalypse. And notice down in the lower right-hand corner, this is the movie where Wolverine gets his adamantium skeleton in the revised timeline. Okay, so we get a very clear date, Ohio, 1983. And we get it confirmed that we are 10 years later than Days of Future Past, because we hear them saying this news comes at a time when the world is celebrating 10 years of peace between mutants and mankind. But the question is, when in 1983 is this happening? Well, we don't get any strong indicators, but I'm going to go with the fact that they go to see Return of the Jedi, and since that came out in May 25th of 1983, I can't imagine anyone not seeing that movie on opening weekend. So I'm going to go with May of 1983. And it's worth noting that this is the first of 4 different movies that was hinting towards the future appearance of Mr. Sinister. Of course, we never got him, but in this case, notice Weapon X, that's Wolverine's blood, is placed into a briefcase labeled Essex Corp. And of course, Essex is the corporation that Mr. Sinister used for all of his nefarious deeds. All right, so now we can add to the timeline X-Men Apocalypse in May of 1983. All right, so next we have 1992's X-Men Dark Phoenix. This is the last of the movies with X-Men in the title that Fox produced before being purchased by Disney, and what a bummer of a way to go out. I mean, the movie started out okay, but man, it ended with a whimper. Ugh, what a bummer. Anyway, the year is prominently displayed. It's 1992, and we're seeing the Space Shuttle Endeavour taking off. Now, it did actually take flight twice in 1992, so we need a little bit more information to know what the month is. But luckily, we get that information because we see that the launch occurs on a school day, because after the launch, Professor X says, no more class, end of the day. Okay, so of the 2 launches in 1992, only one of them was done on a school day, and that's the one in May. All right, so we can place this movie in May of 1992. And then we see at the end of the movie, they're planting white daylilies in honor of Jean Grey, who dies yet again. I think she dies all the time, right? But anyway, white daylilies bloom from late spring to summer, with many varieties blooming in June and July. So that works perfect for the main part of the movie being in May. It's also worth noting that maybe Jean isn't quite so gone after all, because we see the Phoenix floating around in the sky above the Earth. In fact, here we see it basically orbiting the Earth to protect the Earth. So maybe, just maybe, eventually, the Phoenix learned how to turn back into human form, which is why we see Jean Grey alive again in the revised timeline for Days of Future Past. All right, so now we can add in X-Men Dark Phoenix in May of 1992. All right, so now we move to 2016 for the first Deadpool movie. And I'll say right up front, none of the Deadpool movies tell us the year they're occurring. So I'm going to use the release year in each case, but we're going to see that by the time we get to Deadpool and Wolverine, that they've made it pretty clear that using the release year is the right way to go. All right, so the movie starts by flashing back to 2 years ago, which would place us in 2014. And we don't know the exact month when Wade and Vanessa meet, but I'm going to throw out January, because then they talk about how long can you keep this up. And you're going to have to guess what this is if you haven't already figured it out. But anyway, the question is, can we do it all year? So sure enough, they're doing this during Valentine's Day. They're doing this during the Chinese New Year. Now, I will point out they call it the Year of the Dog. Now, that doesn't really work because that would place us in, I guess, 2006 or maybe 2018. But I'm pretty sure they're calling it the Year of the Dog to go along with, well, this. And technically speaking, if we're in 2014, which is what I believe, then it's the Year of the Horse, which actually starts on January 31st, and we're already past Valentine's Day, but that's okay. I don't think they're really wanting this to make sense. It's all just one long joke. All right, but we do move then to International Women's Day, and sure enough, that's on March 8th, so that works. And then we move to Lent. This is really funny. Remember, Lent, you give something up, so they're giving this up, right? And it works because Lent, while it starts on March 5th, goes all the way to April 14th, so that works perfect from a timeline standpoint. Then we move to Halloween, and they do this with those teeth in. Oh, my. Then we move to Thanksgiving, and yes, that is mashed potatoes on their mouth. And then finally, they talk about if your left leg is Thanksgiving and your right leg is Christmas. I'm not going to finish the joke, but yes, we have finally moved to Christmas, and we can finally stop talking about this. Oh, my goodness. Please let that never be part of the timeline hints again. That was painful. Anyway, soon after finishing this, Wade is diagnosed with cancer. Of course, he goes through the long treatments, which ends up turning him into Deadpool. Then we move to present day, where Deadpool is joking about it being Christmas. Now, he doesn't mean that literally. He's just saying he's about to get revenge on the people that turned him into Deadpool. He says, oh, that's because it's Christmas Day, Dopender, and I've been waiting 1 year, 3 weeks, 6 days, and 14 minutes to basically get his revenge. And this works perfectly, because remember, at the beginning of the movie, we flash back to 2 years ago. Then they spent a year doing this, and now he spent a year plotting his revenge. So then he says, Merry Christmas, but we actually finally get the true month it's happening, because Dopender says, and a convivial Tuesday in April to you two pool. So we're in April of 2016. And then we get one more confirmation that the movie spans 2 years, because they talk about how it's been a rough couple of years. So, okay, we can put Deadpool on our timeline in April of 2016. All right, so then we move to 2017 for No Good Deed. And if you've never seen this, it is on YouTube. It's on Ryan Reynolds' personal channel, 31 million views. Very impressive. But let's talk about when this thing is happening and why it's so important. All right, so we see Deadpool is going out for a walk, and then duty calls. He sees this poor old man being held at gunpoint. So he starts booking it around to go find somewhere to change into his costume, but lo and behold, he passes a movie theater playing the Logan movie. So, because Logan came out in March of 2017, that's going to be our timeline placement. But what I think this is a nice wink and a nod to is the fact that obviously in Deadpool 2, he knows that Logan has died. So maybe he stopped to watch the movie afterwards? Either way, because of his fourth wall breaking, he is aware of what happens in the Logan movie. All right, so then he heads into this phone booth, and we get one more fun Easter egg, because notice it says Nathan Summers. And of course, Nathan Summers is Cable, who shows up in Deadpool 2. And yes, I do realize he misspelled coming soon. I'm just going to leave that there. All right, so then he dashes out in his full costume, and there's Stan Lee, who shouts out, "Wow, nice suit." And of course, he responds, "Zip it, Stan Lee." And if that sounds familiar, that's because this scene was shown in the closing credits for Deadpool and Wolverine. So it's just one more reason that it feels to me like they're saying this is canon. But all right, now he's off to save the day, and once again, he passes by a poster for the Logan movie. So they're really pushing the point that he is aware of what happens in this movie. Unfortunately, though, he's took so much time getting into his costume that the old man is dead, so he lays down on the dude and contemplates life and his place in the world. But obviously, I think this has to be canon because this is how he learns about the Logan movie. All right, so I'm going to place No Good Deed in March of 2017. All right, so now we move to the New Mutants, one of the hardest movies to place in the timeline. I'm going to go with 2017, and you'll see why as we discuss this. All right, so it's important to note this is the second of 4 movies that has Mr. Sinister Easter eggs in it. Notice this is Essex Corporation, and even that diamond on the computer there looks like the diamond on his forehead. So then the team asks, what's Essex Corp? And the answer is, it's a scientific organization founded by my superiors. So obviously the New Mutants would have been caught up in this whole Mr. Sinister thing had he actually appeared. And remember, that's the same Essex Corp that was alluded to in X-Men Apocalypse. All right, so then we get an Easter egg for the Logan movie, because the Logan movie deals with transigen, and we're going to see that it is tied with Essex. So Danny gets a vision, and she's asked, where are you? And what she sees is this. So this is from the New Mutants movie. But notice, this is the exact same thing that we also see happening in the Logan movie. So she's getting a vision of something happening in Logan. Once again, here's what she's seeing in the New Mutants movie, and then here's from the Logan movie. So they're obviously tying both the New Mutants movie and Logan together in the same timeline. So when she's asked about what she saw, she says, Essex Corporation. That must have been the place I saw. However, in the Logan movie, we learn that the vision she saw was an event that occurs on August 1st of 2026? What? That's crazy, right? And notice the name from Dr. Xander Rice. He's someone that's going to show up in the Logan movie, and he's the one that ties this to transigen. So basically, transigen and Essex are all working together. Okay, so is this saying then that New Mutants has to happen in 2026? Or is she actually able to see visions of the future? They don't make that very clear in the movie, but we're going to see that there's just no way New Mutants can be happening in 2026. Okay, so there's a calendar on the wall that I thought would be incredibly helpful. However, it's not. It's actually a 1978 calendar. So it's February of 1978. No clue why that is on the wall, but I guess we really can't rely on it. And in fact, we're going to see other evidence that it's not happening during February. So okay, throw the calendar out. Instead, it seems the movie is set in the summertime because Danny's asked, what's the last thing you remember before coming here? And she just arrived at the beginning of the movie. Keep that in mind. And she says it was snowing. But then the response is, in the summertime? So, okay, the movie must be set in the summertime. All right, so we'll go with August. But what year? When is this darn movie happening? Well, we do learn that Xavier's school still appears to be functional because they talk about the fact that they weren't being prepped to be X-Men. And of course, they wouldn't think that unless Professor X's school was still functional. Well, we learn in the Logan movie, which is set in 2029, and we'll talk more about that in just a second, that many are noting a similarity to the Westchester incident over a year ago that left over 600 injured and took the lives of 7 mutants, including several of the X-Men. So that means by 2028, a year before 2029, the school was no longer functional. So that's important. But even more important is what we learn about no new mutants being born since 2004. So Logan says, there are no new mutants. Do you understand? There hasn't been a new one born in 25 years, not anywhere. So 2029 minus 25 gives us 2004. Well, keep in mind, in the New Mutants movie, they're all teenagers. This is a facility for young mutants like yourself. Teens who need some extra care, before they can go on to live healthy adult lives. So if they're all teenagers, there's no way this movie can take place much later than 2017. And actually, director Josh Boone really helps us out. He says it takes place present day. And notice this article was written October 13th of 2017. So the movie was filmed during 2017. It just was delayed for several years and didn't come out until 2020. So this to me is the last piece of evidence that really looks like the movie is taking place in 2017. Because if we put everything together, there were no new mutants born after 2004, and the new mutants are teenagers. Professor X is still running his school, and we know that he accidentally kills several X-Men in 2028. And Danny sees a vision, maybe a future vision, it's kind of got to be, I guess, of an event in 2026 because the movie seems to happen present day, which is when it was filmed in 2017. So, oh my word, this one's a hard one to nail down, but I'm going to go with August of 2017, summertime, for the New Mutants movie. Let me know your thoughts on that, but it really feels like that's the only place to place it. All right, so I want to jump into the future a little bit, 2029 to be precise, to talk about the Logan movie. Number one, because No Good Deed referred to it, right? Remember, Deadpool saw the movie, essentially, at the movie theater. And then number two, we're going to see more of these ties between New Mutants and Logan. All right, so first let's establish that it's definitely 2029. We see that his driver's license expires in 2029, and then on the radio, we hear someone saying, hey, Clyde, it's 2029. All right, so that's taken care of. But what month is it happening? This is really interesting. Okay, so we learn they're located in Oklahoma at this portion of the movie because they talk about Harrah's Hotel and Casino welcomes you to Oklahoma City. And then we learned from a deleted scene that it's harvest season. So, you never know what to do with deleted scenes, but we do get proof in the movie seeing that they're shucking corn. And notice that it's cloned up super corn. It's really important corn to the entire plot of the movie. Okay, so to learn the harvest season for this corn, we need to know what type of corn it is. Well, good news, we get that answer. They talk about the fact no one is eating it, they drink it in corn syrup. Okay, so first of all, what type of corn is used for corn syrup? Well, that would be number 2 yellow dent corn. Okay, and so in Oklahoma, which is where they're at, when do you harvest yellow dent corn? And that answer would be September to October. Okay, wow. Who would have thought that the corn, the type of corn, mind you, would tell us when this movie is placed in the timeline? But it does, so we're going to go with September of 2029. Now, it is worth noting that this line is a little confusing because Logan says, I know I said June, but I need the boat now. So on the surface, that would make you think, oh, it's not yet June, but he's saying, no, I need the boat now. But the corn is actually instrumental to the plot. We have to go with September. So maybe what's happening is June has come and gone, and he didn't ask for the boat, and now he's suddenly going, okay, I know I said June, but I need it now in September. It's not perfect, but again, the corn is vital to the plot, so we have to go with that instead. All right, so now we need to discuss the question of which timeline is Logan in. And it seems like it would be an easy answer, but actually it gets kind of interesting as we go through these quotes. So Logan says, careful, you're speaking to a man who ran a school. And Xavier says it was a special needs school. Of course, he's referring to Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. So that could place us in either the original or revised timeline. Well, then later, Professor X says they're waiting for you at the Statue of Liberty. And Logan says the Statue of Liberty was a long time ago. Of course, they've got to be referring to the first X-Men movie, right? Where the final battle was. And then Professor X says, when I found you, you were pursuing a career as a cage fighter. And of course, that's something we learned in the OG trilogy, because he was cage fighting. And then we see the dog tag, which does have the exact same number that we've seen pretty much throughout every appearance of Logan, so that could really go with either timeline. And then Caliban talks about the bullet that he found in Logan's pocket, sniffs it, and realizes it's made of adamantium. Well, that's a callback to the original timeline when Logan was shot in the head with an adamantium bullet, and that caused his memory loss. And then Professor X mentions that X-23 is his daughter. He says that Alkali has your genetic code. Now, I'm not sure if they're referring to the Alkali Lake, but they definitely could be at this point. And then we see the samurai sword, and of course, that was the sword that he had in The Wolverine. So every one of these references has actually been to the original timeline. And then we get the most important reference that ties us to the revised timeline when we meet Xander Rice. And you might remember that name. That's the name we saw in Danny's vision. So he says, I believe you knew my father on the Weapon X program. And of course, they're referring back to X-Men Apocalypse when in the revised timeline, Wolverine got his adamantium skeleton. And sure enough, he ended up killing his father. So, okay, this neatly ties together all of those Mr. Sinister references, the ones we saw in X-Men Apocalypse, New Mutants, Deadpool 2, and now finally the Logan movie. Man, I really, really wish we would have gotten Mr. Sinister. But all right, that means we have to place the Logan movie in September of 2029 in the revised timeline. Now you might say, why is Logan remembering things from the original timeline? Well, remember, in Days of Future Past, Professor X remembered the original timeline and then informed Logan about it. So they're probably the only two that remember that original timeline. All right, so now we move to Deadpool 2. And remember, none of the movies give us the exact year, but we do know we're after March of 2017 because that's when No Good Deed takes place. All right, so what do we learn about this movie? Well, similar to the first Deadpool movie, we start with a rewind. And in this case, it's back 6 weeks earlier. He says, I need to take you back to the dewy slopes of 6 weeks ago. We learn that Deadpool went on an international killing spree, taking out mass murderers and gangsters, and at the end of that killing spree, he tells the last person he's going after that I really have to go, it's my anniversary. Okay, that's incredibly helpful because remember, in the first Deadpool, he and Vanessa met in January. So January is when the movie's happening, and then 6 weeks earlier would have been in a November timeframe. So we move from November to January. And we do indeed see that when he gets back to see Vanessa, he says, happy anniversary, baby. Unfortunately, Vanessa is then murdered by killers who are seeking revenge on Wade for that, 6-week spree that he went on at the beginning of the movie. So unfortunately, at this point, she's now dead. And to top it all off, he's super depressed because he learned that Logan died when he watched the movie during No Good Deed. Now, it is worth noting that we get this interesting date on this box of cereal. It has an expiration date of 12/28 of 2020. So obviously the movie is happening before December of 2020, but I'm convinced it's in 2018. We'll talk more about that when we get to Deadpool and Wolverine. But I do think it's funny that a box of cereal sponsored by Logan would have a long shelf life, right? It just makes sense. So the next big question is, what year did Cable come from? He uses his device to slide through time and of course came from the future back to the present day. Well, at first I thought we got the answer here, because Deadpool says, I bet 50 years from now we're best as buddies, and he says, 50 years from now you're very dead. So I thought it had to be 2068, in other words, 50 years from 2018. But actually, in the behind-the-scenes featurette for the movie, we get a firm date on the wall, because it is 2054. And obviously, if Deadpool is dead in 2054, he's also still dead in 2068. So, okay, that means that Cable came from 2054. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about Cable's device. Remember, he slides through time, and he used it to fix the past so that his family was still alive in the future. Well, then Deadpool gets a hold of it, and he brings back Vanessa, which is awesome, says, we're definitely naming our kid Cher. And then he goes to save Peter. Go home, Sugar Bear, go home. And Peter's like, all right, well, this has been pretty scary. I love Peter. Then, of course, he uses it to jump into the original timeline to kill that crappy Deadpool. And he uses it to jump into the real world to kill Ryan Reynolds before he gets a chance to actually be in the Green Lantern movie, which, of course, was terrible. And then he says, you're welcome, Canada. So, yeah, he uses it not only to slide in his own timeline, but to jump to other timelines and even the real world. Clearly, as a fourth wall breaker, he does whatever he wants with this device. But keep this in mind, the device is going to come up again in a moment. All right, so a couple connections to mention. They talk about the Essex House for Mutant Rehabilitation, yet another tie-in with Mr. Sinister. Because remember, we learned about Essex both in Dark Phoenix and in New Mutants, and then, of course, Transigen in the Logan movie. Crazy, right? And then we finally get a tie-in with Deadpool and the X-Men. Of course, Deadpool's always joking, there's no X-Men in the mansion. What's the deal here? Well, obviously they used the same cast that was filming Dark Phoenix at the time, but still, in a fourth wall breaking way, this is his way of saying, yes, the X-Men do exist in this universe. He's in the same universe. All right, so now we can place Deadpool 2 in the timeline, taking place in January of 2018. But we also need to add Cable coming from 2054. Which now means, because he went back in time, we have a new version of Deadpool 2 in January 2018, so we have a new timeline. Then we need to add a connection for everything up to and including New Mutants, because they all happened in the third timeline. And then we need to talk about the fact that Deadpool did tons of time travel, obviously, bringing back Vanessa, bringing back Peter, and he even jumped into the original timeline to kill crappy Deadpool. Of course, he also jumped into the real world, so yeah, it's just crazy, right? You just have to let it go and enjoy Deadpool because he does things no one else can do. He's a fourth wall breaker, right? All right, so then we also need to bring in the revised Days of Future Past in June of 2024 and the Logan movie because I think it's still part of this third timeline since in Deadpool and Wolverine, we see him visiting Logan's grave. All right, so now let's talk about Once Upon a Deadpool. And I know you're saying to yourself, why on earth am I trying to stick this thing in the timeline? I'm telling you, hang with me, it fits so perfectly. So I'm going to place it in 2018 for now, and we'll see why in just a second. But we learned in Deadpool and Wolverine that soon after Wade brought Vanessa back from the dead at the end of Deadpool 2, she was pretty freaked out, right? So he went on this mission to convince her that he's actually a hero. Well, what if part of that mission was to go to the real world and try to get Fred Savage to vouch for her that he's a hero? And what better way to do that than to create a version of Deadpool 2 that is more innocent, harmless, and has a minimum amount of strong language? Of course, that would be Deadpool 2, the King James version. So he's doing this to try to get Fred Savage on his side and to vouch for him. And in fact, we did see that he went to the real world, remember? He went and killed Ryan Reynolds before he could become Green Lantern. So I'm guessing that soon after doing that, he went to the real world and visited Fred Savage. I love it. It's perfect, right? So I'm going to place Once Upon a Deadpool in March of 2018. And in fact, that's going to lead perfectly into our next movie, which is Deadpool and Wolverine. Now, the main part of the movie is in 2024, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But you might remember at the beginning of the movie, we get a bit of a flashback, and it turns out Wade used Cable's device for yet another trip to go talk to Happy Hogan. Of course, he went to Earth 616, and in particular, the Sacred Timeline, and we even get the specific month and year that he made this jump. March of 2018. So that means all the crazy things that he did with Cable's device, bringing back Vanessa and killing crappy Deadpool, and I think visiting Fred Savage, all happened prior to visiting Happy in March of 2018. And I say that because he confesses to Paradox that I brought a couple of people back to life with Cable's time machine and then I destroyed it. So he did all of his craziness between January and March of 2018 and then he destroyed the device. So then we jump to 6 years later, which places us in 2024. And in fact, he even says, 6 years ago, you'd all be dead, referring to the fact that he brought several of them back to life with Cable's device. And he says, it's been a challenging few years and I haven't seen you guys in a while. So definitely some time has gone by. So in the movie, we learn that it's Wade's birthday. Of course, that's only semi-helpful because we don't know when his birthday is. But if we turn to the comics, particularly Black Panther versus Deadpool, when he's told, you are a Cancer, he says, I'll have you know I'm a Scorpio. Well, I'm on the cusp. Well, that's interesting because Ryan Reynolds' actual birthday is October 23rd, and that is just on the cusp of being a Scorpio. So, okay, leave it to Ryan Reynolds to make Wade Wilson's birthday the same as his birthday. So that would mean we're in October. And in fact, it does kind of seem like fall. I mean, these trees have all their leaves turned. And then here again, we see trees with the leaves that have basically fallen off the tree. So yeah, late fall makes perfect sense. October of 2024. And in the movie, we see that Colossus is watching the Great British Bake Off. And in 2024, that premiered on September 24th and ran all the way to the end of November. So once again, October is looking great. Now, it is worth noting that Wade verifies that Logan is dead, very dead, because he goes well past Logan's movie in 2029 to the point where, basically his skin is rotted off. So this again tells us that the Logan movie is in the same timeline as Deadpool and Wolverine. Also, it's worth noting that X-23 likely comes from 2037, and you can figure that out by comparing Daphne Keene's age when she filmed Logan versus when she filmed this movie. So, we can now add Deadpool and Wolverine to the timeline, and it goes in October of 2024. But we do need to talk about the fact that Paradox wanted to use a Time Ripper to destroy Wade's universe 10005. And in fact, we saw that Cassandra nearly destroyed it. She took it all the way down to 1%. And it took the heroic efforts of Deadpool and Wolverine to do the impossible and to regenerate the universe. And in fact, B-15 tells them as much. She says, I'm going to show you something huge. Did you see that? Your universe is regenerating. Whatever you did here, you not only saved your world, you spared your timeline from extinction. And notice this is what their universe used to look like, but it was destroyed down to nothing and regenerated all over again. And we even have Wade saying, found your new anchor being, referring to the fact that the Wolverine in this movie replaces the one that died in the Logan movie. So I think what they're saying is, when they regenerated the universe, it replaced the Wolverine on the left with the one on the right. Likewise, it replaced the X-23 on the left with the one on the right. And it even explains things like Mystique, who of course died in Dark Phoenix, will now be coming back for Doomsday because of course she was in the Chair Watch. So now we need to add to the timeline the fact that at the end of the movie, the universe was recreated. And then there's one more thing we need to talk about. So I think at the end of the Marvels that Monica Rambeau was transported to the 10005 universe, the same one that we've been following along with all this time. So the Beast, yep, that's the same Beast that we know and love. And when they refer to Charles needing an update, I think that's the same Professor X. And in fact, because the universe was recreated from scratch, that would explain how we now have a binary in this universe that we've never met before. So I think it fits so perfectly that Monica Rambeau popped into this universe, so I'm going to add to the timeline that she showed up in September of 2026. So the reason I'm saying that is I believe that 10005 and 616 have synced timelines. So basically we saw in Deadpool 2 that he left 10005 and showed up in 616 at the same time, March of 2018. So therefore, the Marvels, which takes place in September 2026, or at least that's where I place it, I think Monica Rambeau showed up in 10005 in 2026. So you can check out my timeline video on Phase 5 if you want to see exactly how all this works, but I love the fact that these two universes appear to be perfectly synced together. All right, and so now we're finally going to close things down by talking about Legion. And remember, this is the one thing that I think is not part of the main X-Men universe, and we'll see even more reasons why as we talk about it. All right, so I really enjoyed this series. It's a lot of fun. I recommend checking it out if you haven't seen it. But David Haller is the main character, and he has dissociative identity disorder, and that leads to some really trippy stuff throughout the series. So we also learn that David Haller is Charles Xavier's son, and in fact, they meet in the third season, which is really cool. But this is most definitely not the same Charles Xavier we've been following in Universe 10005. I say that because here are just some of the things we learned about his history. Charles Xavier was a British soldier in World War II, which immediately knocks him out of contention, right? Because the 10005 Charles Xavier didn't go to the war. So then at some point after the war, Charles was committed to a mental hospital where he met Gabrielle. He then helped bring her out of a catatonic state and used his powers to coerce the hospital into releasing them. They were married, and soon after they had their child named David. And then David seems to be in his late 20s to maybe early 30s. It's really hard to tell. In fact, we can't even really tell when this series is taking place. But you can kind of do some math if you use all these facts. So if Charles was in World War II and then went to a mental hospital and then finally broke out and finally had David, he maybe had him around 1949, 1950. And if David is around 30, then we might be 1979 to 1980 timeframe. Also, it is worth noting that regarding when the two of them meet, David and Charles, they say if David meets his father and his father is his age. Okay, so that helps us kind of limit this down even more, because that means Charles was probably 30 when he had David, and now David is 30 and going back in time and meeting his father. So yeah, I really like 1979, 1980, that type of time frame for the series. So one thing we do learn about David's age is he's at least 10,000 days old, because in the trippy time travel episodes, we see in his timeline the number 10,000 days. And if you divide that by 365, that means he's over 27. But we get an even better indication of his age when he meets his father, because Charles says dreaming, and he says, I had that same feeling for 30 years. Okay, so he's at least 30 years old. So let's look at some of the other things we learn about him. So he was taken to Summerland. It used to be a horse ranch. It was inherited in the 40s, and the current facility was built 30 years ago. So again, you can do that math, and that's placing us in the late 70s, early 80s. All right, so now let's talk about the main antagonist of the show. That is the Shadow King, who takes on several different personas, one of which is played by Aubrey Plaza. Oh my goodness, she is so amazing in this series. I love her in anything she does, but she was great in this show. Now, one thing worth mentioning is there is some confusion about whether or not the show Legion is tied to the Dark Phoenix movie, because while David is being watched on this monitor, several characters are talking about him, and they say, are we clear on the scope and nature of this power? No, but if the readings are right, he may be the most powerful mutant that we have ever encountered. And then they say, well, after what happened at Red Hook, I'd say that's an understatement. So naturally, one might think, oh, they're talking about the Red Hook incident at the beginning of the Dark Phoenix movie. But no, they're actually referring to an incident that involved David himself. Because later in the episode, they say, now let's talk about the incident, the Red Hook incident, at Clockworks. So they're talking about David. So I can definitely understand how that led to some confusion, but no, there is no tie between this show and the Dark Phoenix movie. This show is in a totally different universe. But speaking of interesting connections, some people have noticed that the same actor that plays a young David Haller in one of the flashback episodes is the same actor that showed up in Deadpool 2. Yep, he's the kid with that cereal box, remember, that had the funky expiration date on it? So naturally people have said, wait, is this the same character then? In fact, the actor himself, clever little kid, made it even more confusing because look at his hashtags. He puts hashtag HeroFlakes, Wolverine, Young David, Legion, Easter eggs, question mark? You gotta love it. I mean, the dude is great at marketing his work. But no, there is no way that he's the same kid in Deadpool 2 and in Legion. Because remember, Deadpool 2 takes place in 2018. That would mean the Legion series is in like 2030. But we know that David's dad was Charles Xavier, and he fought in World War II. So no, this is just really clever marketing by the young actor, but there is no connection between Deadpool 2 and the Legion series. All right, so I've talked about the fact that the series takes place, I believe, in the late 70s, early 80s. But what month? Well, in Season 1, Episode 2, maybe this is fall weather. It's kind of hard to tell. Later in the episode, they go for a walk in the woods. Some of the trees are missing leaves. There's some dead branches. But certainly by Season 1, Episode 8, the trees look like fall. I mean, things are brown, the leaves have fallen off the trees, etc. And then it's worth noting that at the end of Season 1, David is captured. He's screaming, "Help me," inside that weird ball-looking thing there. And then at the beginning of Season 2, we learn it's a full year after Season 1. You were gone for a year, but it only felt like a few hours. And then I think Season 3 picks up right after Season 2. Maybe there's a month or two, but not much. All right, so now we can add it to the timeline. I am going to stick it just over in the corner, not connected to anything, because it's really a different universe. And I'm going to say just 1970s or 1980s. So now we can change this from X-Men timeline so far to just simply X-Men timeline. So there you have it. This is everything that takes place in the X-Men timeline, as detailed as I can make it. Let me know your thoughts. I really want to know, do you think I got stuff right? Do you think I got it wrong? I love to hear all your feedback. And then don't forget, I do have my Google Sheet timeline document out there. It's sorted by timeline, month, and year by default, but you can also sort by release, and also you can filter by creating a temporary view, and if you happen to pick the X-verse, then you get everything related to the X-Men universe. I had a lot of fun putting this together, and it has all the information we discussed in this video. So don't forget about that August contest. Be a subscriber, leave a comment, win a book or a steelbook, and we have the membership option in case you're interested in that. And I always love to mention the Discord. Here we are in the Marvel Timelines chat, and you can see Specs sharing his information about when some of these movies and shows happen in the timeline. Plus, I promised I would talk about the Doomsday Countdown Watch on the Discord. Every day listed here, we'll watch a different movie or show as we lead up to the December 18th, 2026 release of Doomsday. So we have 2,300 members across the globe, conversations 24/7, and I'll leave a pinned comment so you can join. Also, if you don't mind, like this video, subscribe if you haven't already. You can check out more content, and we'll all continue to enjoy the ever-growing, the ever-changing Marvel Cinematic Universe.